Noam Chomsky, in your, if I'm not mistaken, first TV media appearance for Serbian media. Thank you very much for being with us. Last month marked the 7th anniversary of the beginning of the bombing of Yugoslavia. Why did NATO wage that war? Or I should say, why did the United States wage that war?
Well, actually, we have, for the first time, a very authoritative comment on that from the highest level of the Clinton administration. Mm-hmm. Which is something that one could have surmised before, but now it is asserted. This is from Stroop Talbot, who was in charge of the, he ran the Pentagon State Department Intelligence Joint Committee on the diplomacy during the whole affair, including the bombing. So that's very top of the Clinton administration. Mm-hmm. He just wrote the foreword to a book by his director of communications, John Norris. And in the foreword he says, if you really want to understand what the thinking was in the top of the Clinton administration, this is the book you should read. And you'll take a look at John Norris's book, and what he says is the real purpose of the war had nothing to do with concern for Kosovo Albanians. It was because Serbia was not carrying out the required social and economic reforms, meaning it was the last corner of Europe which had not subordinated itself to the U.S.-run neoliberal programs, so therefore had to be eliminated. That's from the highest level. Again, you could have guessed it, but I've never seen it said before. I mean, that it wasn't because of the Kosovo Albanians, that we know. There is just, I mean, this is a point of religious fanaticism in the West. Can't talk about it for interesting reasons having to do with Western culture. But there is just overwhelming documentation of impeccable documentation. Two big compilations of the State Department trying to justify the war, the OSCE records, NATO records, the KVM Monitor records, long British parliamentary inquiry which went into it. They all show the same thing. I mean, sort of what we knew. I mean, it was an ugly place. There were atrocities.
But given this clear documentary record, I want to ask you about the elite intellectual opinion, what you call in the United States,
and the West,
because it was, and in the West in general, because
that's for different
reviewing it, you would get the impression, you would be forgiven for imagining that every critic of the NATO intervention was one of two things: either a Milosevic sympathizer or someone who doesn't care about genocide. What does this mean?
Well, first of all, that's a common feature of intellectual culture. One good U.S. critic, Harold Rosenberg, once described intellectuals as the herd of independent minds. They think they're very independent, but they're stampede in a herd, which is true. When there's a party line, you have to adhere to it. And the party line is systematic. The party line is subordination to state power and to state violence. Now, you're allowed to criticize it, but on very narrow grounds. You can criticize it because it's not working, or it's a mistake, or benign intentions that went astray, or something. In fact, you see it right now in the Iraq War. There's a ton of debate about the Iraq War, but take a look at it. It's very similar to the debate in Pravda during the invasion of Afghanistan. Actually, I brought this up to a Polish reporter recently and asked him if he'd been reading Pravda. He just laughed. He said, yeah, it's the same. Now, you read Pravda in the 1980s, it's you know, the travail of the Russian soldiers, too many are getting killed. There are these terrorists who prevent us from bringing justice and peace to the Afghans. We of course didn't invade, we intervened in order to try to help them at the request of the legitimate government, and the terrorists are preventing us from doing all the things we want to do. You know, yeah. I've read Japanese counterinsurgency documents from the Second World War, from the 1930s. Same, you know, we're trying to bring them an earthly paradise, but the Chinese bandits are preventing it. In fact, I don't know of an exception in history. You go back to British imperialism, it's the same. I mean, even people of the highest moral integrity, like John Stuart Mill, were talking about, well, we have to intervene in India and conquer India because the barbarians can't control themselves. They commit atrocities to bring them the benefits of British rule and civilization and so on. Now, in the United States, the same. Now, take the bombing of Kosovo. That was a critically important event for American intellectuals. And the reason had to do with what was going on during the 90s. The 90s are, for the West, not just the U.S., France and England are worse. It's probably the low point in intellectual history for the West, I think. I mean, it was like a comic strip mimicking a satire of Stalinism, literally. You take a look at the New York Times and the French press, the British press. It was all full of talk about how there's a normative revolution that has swept to the West. For the first time in history, a state, namely the United States, the leader of the free world, is acting from pure altruism. Clinton's policy has entered into a noble phase with a saintly glow. On and on. I'm quoting from the liberals.
Now, this particular humanitarian charade
was pre-Kosovo.
Right, and it was specific in a sense because it was based on the claim that it was preventing genocide. Let me just read something that you said in an interview around the time of the bombing. You said, "The term genocide, as applied to Kosovo, is an insult to the victims of Hitler. In fact, it's revisionist to an extreme." What did you mean by that?
First of all, let me just fix the timing. Right. The things I've been quoting are from the late 90s.
Before Kosovo.
Yeah. Now, they needed some event to justify this massive self-adulation. Okay? Along came Kosovo, fortunately. All right, so now we have to stop genocide. What was the genocide in Kosovo? We know from the Western documentation what it was. In the year prior to the bombing, according to just the Western sources, about 2,000 people were killed. Killings were distributed. A lot of them were coming, in fact, according to the British government, which was the most hawkish element of the alliance, up until January 1999, a majority of the killings were by the KLA guerrillas, who were coming in, as they said, to try to incite a harsh Serbian response, which they got, in order to appeal to Western humanitarians to bomb. Well, we know from the Western records that nothing changed between January and March. In fact, up until March 20th, they indicate nothing. March 20th, they indicate an increase in KLA attacks. But it was ugly, but by international standards, I mean, almost invisible, unfortunately. And it was very distributed. If the British are correct, the majority was coming from KLA guerrillas.
And as it later turned out, the KLA was also receiving financial and military support. I mean,
they were being supported by the CIA in the early in those months. Okay, so that's not to call that genocide. Is really to insult the victims of the Holocaust. If that's genocide, then the whole world is covered with genocide. In fact, it's kind of striking that right at the same time that Western intellectuals were praising themselves for their magnificent humanitarianism, much worse atrocities were going on right across the border in Turkey. That's inside NATO, not at the borders of NATO. They were saying, how can we allow this at the borders of NATO? Yeah. How about inside NATO, where Turkey was had driven probably several million Kurds out of their homes, destroyed about 3,500 villages, laid waste to the whole place, every conceivable form of torture and massacre that you can imagine, killed nobody knows how many people. We don't count our victims, tens of thousands of people. How were they able to do it? The reason is because they were getting 80% of their arms from Clinton. And as the atrocities increased, the arms flow increased. In fact, in one single year, 1997, Clinton sent more arms to Turkey than the entire Cold War period combined up until the counterinsurgency. That was not reported in the West.